All right, we are recording live with Sanjana, who has a interesting podcast that I recently got into, and we met a little bit on Clubhouse and got into a few little talks. And then I saw recently in her podcast that she did with Lee Cronin, where she brought up some interesting topics. So today we want to talk about that, specifically the sort of psychology of God, or the Carl Jung God, or the depth psychology God. But before we dive into that for a little bit, Sanjana, do you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself and your podcast and that kind of stuff?
Yeah, of course. So I'm Sanjana, and I'm an academic student. I study at Tel Aviv University in the liberal arts program. I'm majoring in psychology and minoring in digital communications and AI. Also, I have two basic tracks with philosophy and Middle Eastern studies. So that's about my university. But apart from that, I'm very much interested in psychoanalysis and philosophy, both continental and analytical, but mostly existential philosophers. And I'm also interested in a variety of topics. I'm more of a multidisciplinary person. So I tend to learn as much as possible about all of these different disciplines in general. In terms of podcasting, I have the podcast called The Naked Dialogue, wherein I tend to get guests who are, essentially intellectuals or even friends sometimes, and where we engage in variety of research topics and what their works are. And I've had a good amount of intellectuals on. I think it's been almost like 35 episodes by now, and it seems like a very good hobby to me because I tend to learn so much about so many other disciplines.
Right.
So yeah, podcasting is something I take as a serious hobby, apart from reading and writing in itself. So yeah, that's pretty much about me in general, I guess, in a nutshell.
And by the way, you got a little bit of a following on Clubhouse. Can you say anything about what that phenomenon has been like? It's kind of like, I think last year it kind of shot into the stratosphere like a rocket, and now it's coming down to earth. People are on it a little bit less than they used to, but can you say anything about your Clubhouse experience and what that's been like?
Oh yeah, sure. So I think I joined at the end of January. I got the invite from one of my really good friend called Zeus Tapardo, who works for, who's in the psychedelic industry essentially. And I joined in, and at first, the first 2-3 weeks, I was just going to all sorts of rooms and just like discussing all sorts of topics from, Bitcoin to economy and other stuff. But then, Eric Weinstein and all of these other intellectuals started popping up, and I would listen to them quite heavily. And then again, I started, raising my hand and engaging in conversations with them. I also started hosting a lot of philosophy as well as psychoanalysis rooms in general. And I think that's where I got like most of the followers from, in general. I was also, very fortunate enough to be in rooms with Yoshabak and, Eric Weinstein and Lex Friedman from time to time. So that was also very interesting to, being able to talk to these amazing intellectuals. And I think up till the end of mid-June, either at the end of June or like mid-June, I was highly active, but then I think Clubhouse kind of died in a way. Yeah, like a lot of intellectuals just went off, maybe because of the whole COVID ending scenario, just getting bored of it, who knows.
Yeah.
So yeah, after that point, I stopped using it that often. Now I only go on like social rooms, and if there's any important, once in a blue moon kind of a room, I would go in. So yeah, I think that's very much a good detail about my Clubhouse experience.
Yeah. And then, yeah, speaking of the podcast, like I mentioned a little bit when we started, I was listening to one of your podcasts, I don't know, a little while back, and I thought it was interesting. You opened up your discussion with Lee Cronin, and you presented this idea of how Carl Jung looked at God, or the God image, or whatever you want to call it, talking about his interview where he was asked if he believes in God, and Carl Jung says, I don't know, or I don't believe, or I don't need to believe because I know. And then, you're kind of presenting that to Lee Cronin, and that was kind of a little bit like probably outside of his wheelhouse, so he pivoted a different direction, which is fine. But I like the direction you're going, so I thought we might talk a little bit about that today, because it's kind of some things that I normally read about and study for whatever reason. So I thought, yeah, if you can just like go into like, I don't know, what is it that you think Carl Jung was getting at there, or gets at in general, with sort of like the depth psychology view of God?
I think when he started to, get into mythology in general, because, he grew up in a very Catholic environment back in Switzerland. So he had like all of his parents, like specifically his father, was very, very Christian. He was almost like, I think he was a priest. So he grew up in a very religious environment. And after he got his medical degree, he was only involved in the medicine and the psychiatric realms. But then right after, getting into the medical sphere, I think it was 1900 when Freud came up with the interpretation of dreams that Freud had, and Jung read it. And he suddenly got very much interested in, the psychoanalytical concepts of Freud. And then at some point, he started to really get into what is happening with the schizophrenic patients. And so he wrote this paper, which was called The Psychology of Dementia Precox. So dementia precox being like schizophrenia. And he sent that paper to Freud so that he can read it. And then Freud got very much interested in, what, the paper in itself, and that's how they, met. And I think that it was back in 1907 that he met Freud. And then after that, his whole trajectory started. But while he was, closely associated with Freud, discussing free association and word association, I think he started to really look into the archaic residues that tend to lie within dreams. Maybe that kind of led him into how dreams and visions might have some sort of a mythopoetic imagination. And that's how I think Jung got into mythology in general. And when he got into mythology, he also got into precognition. That's where the catalytic exteriorization phenomena came in, and also psychokinesis, which is basically moving objects with mental effort, and all of these concepts which have some sort of esoteric elements to them. And the split between Freud and Jung happened right after he got into these ideas. So I think in terms of religion and mythology, I think religion, just being a huge part of his childhood, was always going to be an influence within his own analytical, psychoanalytic journey. And also, mythologies in which he was very much interested because of the collective and unconscious aspect that he, he crafted. And so I think, I think that's how, Jung kind of got into this religious, mythological realms.
Yeah, it's interesting because we kind of like very quickly went over his almost his whole life and career there, which somewhat started when he was a child, but then just with his background with his father and religion and all those things, and then his medical career started about 1900. I think his doctoral dissertation was 1902, which is interesting because that was based off of his cousin who was like trying to be a psychic medium and conjuring spirits and speaking to them and that kind of things. So what he was after was just like, what's going on with all these people mentally and whatever else, because on one hand there's good stuff going on there. People find meaning in their life and all those things. On the other hand, sometimes those kind of behaviors lead to psychosis and some other things. So he's trying to make sense of it all. And then, yes, he ultimately got into every little area to make sense of that. And the split with Freud was, I guess, what was it? Basically, Freud believed,
I think it was 1913, right, when the split happened.
Yeah, 12 or 13. And so Freud was basically saying that his sort of psychology or philosophy was the blank slate kind of idea, that we're born and we're pretty close to a blank slate at that point. And so then our unconscious that we are very affected by is basically what happens from the time that we're born up until our whole life. So the unconscious is just the personal unconscious. And so Carl Jung had a dream where he went into, and within this dream he went into a basement of this house. And this is kind of like the real quick version for the sake of time. But he was in a house, he went into the basement of the house, and then basically he said that symbolizes discovering the personal unconscious that Freud did. But then he found like some kind of a passageway to a deeper chamber underneath the basement. And he said that was representing the collected unconscious, as he later came to understand it, which is the idea that we're not only our personal unconscious, but we're also affected by the unconscious that we have inherited. And then I think I saw on your Instagram that one of these situations where Freud fainted because I think it was in that dream where he found two skulls inside this place. And I don't know if Jung ever got into the symbolism of that, or I don't remember what it was, but Freud thought it was like he had a fatherly death wish upon him. So he fainted and he's all afraid that Jung wants him dead. And it was that, plus when he wrote his book, what's it called? Because there's like a German version of the title, and then the English version is basically the psychology of the unconscious is how it's translated now, which is Collected Works number 5. Anyway, in that he puts forth that idea to the full level, that we have this not only unconscious level, but collected unconscious level. And he's basically chronicling and interpreting this lady, she's a poet, I believe, Frances Miller, who's also a schizophrenic woman. And so within her schizophrenic fits, she writes poetry, and then he interprets it to say some of this poetry is conscious, some of it's personal unconscious, and some of it is collected unconscious symbols coming forth. And anyway, so that was kind of like the end of the Freud-Jung relationship and the beginning of Carl Jung doing his own thing, writing the Red Book and the rest of his collected works and all that. But anyway, so it was in his medical career and psych and career starting, basically what became the deeper depths of depth psychology, sort of Freud started depth psychology and Jung made it even deeper, is he didn't talk about God very specifically or explicitly, only maybe implicitly. But then it was that interview that we mentioned a little bit where he was kind of confronted very explicitly, like, do you believe in God? And he says, I don't need to believe, I know. Now, if you look into his other writings, like Answer to Job and some of his letters, basically what he's talking about is God as a psychological fact. But I don't know. What do you think in terms of God, or maybe not your position, but specifically Carl Jung's or the depth psychology perspective of God?
Sure. So first, let me comment on the whole Freud
Yeah.
thing.
That's fun stuff. Go ahead.
Yeah. So I was reading this book by Gary Lachman, really good historian, but also, I guess, a psychologist who wrote a book called Jung the Mystic. And that's where I read this whole Freud fainting stuff. And basically what happened was Freud and Jung, one of Freud's followers was had invited sorry, apologies, had invited Jung and Freud to this conference. And the conference was happening in somewhere in the north of Germany. And there they had, Jung had a couple of drinks, but Jung had a very low tolerance for drinking. And so he started talking about all of these pharaohs and, you know, how one of the pharaoh had a death wish on Amenhotep, something like that was the pharaoh's name.
Right.
And when Freud was listening to that, he essentially fainted. I don't know, maybe because of the way, you know, Jung was delivering that. But then after 3 years later, he was in Munich for another conference. And in this other conference, basically, what happened was that he fainted again. And this time he fainted again and said that maybe Jung has a death wish against me. You know, and it's hilarious that, you know, Freud thought that. So yeah, these were the two famous faintings of Freud, and it's quite hilarious, to be honest. So in terms of God now, so yeah, the very famous John Freeman interview, which is available on YouTube, that people can watch. You know, John Freeman very bluntly asks him, do you believe in God? And then, you know, as I said, I don't know. I know that there is a God. But then later, after it was telecasted, I think he got a lot of criticism for that. So he wrote a public letter, both to John Freeman and also to the people and his followers, that you know, he didn't mean that he knows that there is a God. He just thinks that God is a psychological image.
Right.
Yeah, a psychological fact. So so when I was talking about this with Lee Cronin, I think where he was getting at was that there's one thing which is a fact, and then there's another thing which is a belief. So because he being a chemist from a scientific background, of course he wouldn't comment on God. So that's why he rejected the whole notion of, you know, Jung and the God aspect. Did I answer all of the thing there?
Yeah, well, absolutely. But like, the thing is that this is one area. Okay, so like, I think it's either the introduction or the first chapter of Answer to Job. Carl Jung gives this example of, like, if there were a people that believed, I think he says the river Rhine flowed backwards, and like that culture believed that, it wouldn't be physically, factually true necessarily, but it would be a psychological fact. Just like anything else that may be believed in history, you could name any number of things that people have believed in the past that we maybe later had decided was not true. I mean, you know, there's been you can think of any number of things, like doctors used to think smoking was good for you. And you could say that wasn't just a physical fact. In fact, you could say physically that was untrue, but psychologically it was factual. So in anything in our history, or in history in general, you could say that if people believed it or still believe it, or whether that's a small group of people or a big group of people for whatever period of time, if it happened in the culture, that, or even if one person, even if one sort of even if one crazy person believed a thing to be true that maybe wasn't necessarily true, then physically factually, that may not be the case, but psychologically factually, it is the case, because based on those beliefs or those psychological interpretations of reality, people live their lives. You know, just like they built huge pyramids, they built huge temples, they built you know, these cathedrals that took hundreds of years to build, not because, I mean, you could say maybe not, there was a physical or actual God, but that's sort of beside the fact psychologically. The psychological fact was that in history, people have believed in such entities that it caused people to behave a certain way, and it formed the psychology of human beings a certain way. So that's to try to get at what at least Carl Jung puts forward as a psychological fact versus a physical fact. And he gets at that a little bit in the letters, and I think in Man and His Symbols, which was his last book that he helped write, and as well as the Answer to Job that I mentioned there. But I don't know, what do you think in terms of a psychological fact versus a factual fact?
So I feel like a psychological fact is more based on instinctual instincts, which are somewhat connected with your subconscious and unconscious aspects of psyche. So you know how Jung proposed number one type of personality versus number two type of personality. So number one type of personality being, you know, but number two,
actually, you cut off there for a second. I don't know why, but can you just repeat what you said? Yeah, you're back. So if you can just repeat what you said about like number one personality.
Oh yeah, sure. So there's two type of personality that he proposed. So number one personality being, you know, revolving around worldly things and academia, while number two personality being, you know, these dreams and visions and everything. So when we talk about a psychological fact being a intuitive and instinctual drive, which arises from the subconscious and the unconscious, I think you know, Jung was trying to get at these two personalities, but mostly at the number two personality. So I think that would be a psychological fact from Jungian psychoanalytical perspective. But when we talk about a factual fact, it's like 2 + 2 is 4. You know, it's more logical, it's more scientific, it's testable, you know, it's not a hypothesis, it's actually testable. So I think that would be more or less the distinction that I can work with.
So yeah, so is there anything else we can say in terms of, because yeah, I have tried to have some of these I don't know, conversations or whatever with some people, sort of like you were getting into with Lee Cronin, and again, nothing against him, it's just like maybe outside of his wheelhouse or his particular philosophy or area of study. But yeah, I'm just wondering what you think in more in any terms of like God as a symbolic or mythical entity, perhaps, and what that means for us. And well, maybe I'll just try to say briefly, kind of like what I think of that is that, you know, I think of what Jung calls these images, not just meaning like the way, you know, he calls them images or sometimes archetype, but he says the God image. And I don't think he often says the God archetype. But what he's talking about, or sometimes he would say imago, the sort of Latin, but what he's talking about is like the experience that we have with a particular idea or symbol, meaning that if I say God, then there is a particular idea or image or whatever that comes to people's mind, and that has evolved over our course of history, whether that you want to say that's 10,000 years or a million years or whatever the case. Just like everything else that we have in terms of a psychological image within us. And you could even think of it in terms of like word association tests like that, where we have these images that have evolved. So like some of the most common like archetypes that we, you know, constantly interact with are like the mother and father archetype. So like if I say mother or father to a person, those might be a little bit easier to grasp exactly what's going on with those images or archetypes, but maybe not necessarily, because on one hand you could say, oh yeah, that's my mom, that's my dad or whatever, but it also talks about, you know, like the authority of ourselves and the authority that we have to be, and you know, the mother within nature, the father within culture, and then at the totality of all that is the God image. The totality of all images is basically the self, as Jung might call it, the image of God, or the image of the totality of all being, probably the Jungian self archetype. So basically, I would look at it as this like evolving image that, as that we evolve a better understanding of it, you can look at it not necessarily theologically, like how that we would have an apologetic debate over like what God is or isn't, but how that we interact with that archetype or that image over time, pragmatically. So everybody has they have different God images, and they have different ways that they behave towards their cosmic understanding or their belief of the cosmos. And that's each person's God image. Everyone has one. And so that is evolving, and it's pragmatically so that us as individuals and as the collective culture can better orient ourselves and as to how to act within the world. So even if you're an agnostic or an atheist or whatever the case, you still operate within a relationship towards a God image, just because that's how that we have evolved, and we have a relationship towards the totality of all being, which is the essential God image, or the image of the self, as Jung would call it. So that's sort of how that I try to look at it, which I know is a complex mouthful. But I'm wondering how that you might look at it, either in something like depth psychology terms or just in any terms at all.
I think it's, you know, the God image plus, you know, the different mythologies that come together, which form archetypes. Mm. So that's how they're universal patterns. Mm. I think what Jung was trying to get at with the archetypes within the collective unconscious was exactly the fact that, you know, there's a deeper God image and deeper mythological stuff coming together that tend to arise within our dreams through symbolism. And I think that's how we, try to interpret psychology behind dreams in general. So I think also, I think at a very different note, Jung also used to indulge in creative play.
Right.
So, in
active imagination,
play,
he calls it.
Exactly. So, when he was growing up, he would, do all sorts of creative plays. So, drawing mandalas. So, putting stones together to see, how the structures are making. And I think he was doing it in order to discover his own myth in a very esoteric, intrinsic way.
Right.
I think, that was also a very interesting aspect of Jungian psychoanalysis, that we have to indulge in active imagination constantly, just also to broaden our conscious mind, but also to reach some sort of a state of individuation, if possible. Why active imagination? And active imagination, I think, might also aid some sort of dream interpretation at some level. I'm not sure. So yeah, those were certain really good aspects that he, he crafted and tends to play out in that way. Also, like, I think, when the whole Freud and Jung split was happening, I think Freud appointed Jung as the president of the International Psychoanalytical Society. And I think
and he called him the Crown Prince.
Exactly. And I think that happened in 1910. But after, their differences, I think he resigned in 1930. And then he took his own turn into, investigating all sorts of different kinds of disciplines. So that's why he got into astrology, religion, Christian religion. Then also he went to India, went to Africa, started traveling a lot in order to broaden this analytical psychoanalysis that he was trying to put forward to the world. And I think Jung is very much unique in that aspect. And how Jungians are often, criticized because of Jung's inclination towards all of these esoteric realms. But I think it's honestly stupid because, like, if anything, I think Jung was probably the most read, the most researched person ever. I'm not saying that Freud wasn't important, but I think Jung just took Freud to another level. And tried to get into all of these different disciplines. And I think the reason why he did it was because in order to understand the human psyche, you really have to dive into literally every single aspect that constitutes the mental contents of our psyche. And he did that by investigating theology, general contents of the mind, neurochemistry, when he was in the medical institute, everything. And I think in that way, Jung is unique. I'm sure you also might know of Marie-Louis France, who was also his student, and also James Hillman, Sonu Shamdasani. I think Sonu Shamdasani and James Hillman talked about the contents of the Red Book that he had, which had all of these illustrations that he made. And I think the book was called The Lament of the Dead. And it's a really good book. It's basically like a dialogue between Sonu Shamdasani and James Hillman, just discussing the contents of the Red Book. So that's also a really, really good book that anyone can read.
Yeah, well, so what was going on there, and that's another I like how we're just going like taking these big huge sweeps over the Jungian career and the all the mythology and everything. And yeah, basically what he did is he figured out like we can't just like and he even said in like most of his writing that he agrees with Freud and the others at that time, Adler and others, but he said that their psychology is right, but it just stops at a certain point where there's a lot more. It's not just about people with their social complexes like Adler, or it's not just about people like that want to have sex with everything or have all these like childhood repressions and all this. It may be that, but then there's also a lot more, especially when you look at like the whole world, like he talked about travel, like he talked about how he traveled the world. He even went to the Pueblo Indians in North America. But basically just looking at the way that people interact with reality. And for some people, they might be really happy with that. They might be really losing their mind, and they might be anywhere in between. And so he was laying out why that may or may not be. And then he starts to see these mythological motifs. And it's interesting that you brought up Marie-Louise von Franz, because basically they met right after World War II, and she really took his alchemy and his mythological studies to another level, because a lot of those books weren't translated into English or German yet. They were just in Latin. And so she, meeting him when she was young and became his secretary, she went to school for ancient languages or something, mainly studying Latin. So she actually translated a lot of these alchemical books, mostly from Latin or other dead languages, into English or German. And then that's where they got their understanding, is because all of this is like using a God image or projecting onto matter in terms of the alchemists, or all the other mythological motifs. It's projecting out the contents of the entirety of the psyche, the conscious and unconscious mind, and then we interact with it, just like he did with his active imagination and his contents of the Red Book. It's to pour out these images and then interact with the totality of our consciousness. And then yeah, he left that legacy for us. The only thing where people, I think, get confused is a lot of people are more scientifically minded, of course, and the thing is with needing to be healed, so he was a pragmatist in that regard, where he says it doesn't really matter sometimes some of these physical facts or whatever. What matters is what will get a person healed, whether that's a certain artistic thing that they do, a certain thing that they do with their dreams, a certain thing that they do with their religious life, or whatever will get them mentally healthy again is what matters. And so he went at that pragmatic approach, whereas most of the other psychiatric scientists want to like put everything in these little linear cause and effect boxes that the complex system of the mind doesn't necessarily work that way to achieve healing. And how that we interact with the image of the totality of all being, the God image, that's going to be different for everyone. And for some people that might be very explicitly in whatever religious tradition that they have. And for some people that might be more pretending that they are atheist or agnostic because you still have a relationship with the cosmos and the totality of all being, even if a person calls themselves non-religious. We can't get around interacting with religious images. in our lives. So so that's what he was getting at. And so yeah, I don't know what else how else can we solve the problem of God using depth psychology and mythology and anything else? What do you think?
So just to briefly comment
Yeah.
on the distinction between the contents of the psyche between Freud and Jung. I think Freud had so the conscious mind, the unconscious mind, and the pre-conscious mind, while Jung borrowed the conscious mind, but with the ego element to it, ego in the central aspect, and then the personal unconscious, and then the collective unconscious. And also, talking about Marie-Louise von Franz, there's a really good book called Projection and Reprojection in psychology.
I always mess up the title of that. It's Projection and Recollection of the Unconscious. It has a long, confusing title. I know what you're talking about. It's on Audible too.
So it's called Projection and Recollection in Jungian Psychology, Reflections of the Soul.
Yes, there you go. It's very important because
it's very important. So
gets at that, but yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. So I think she basically takes a Jungian concept of projection, but expands on it, and also adds the element of recollection. So projection and recollection. So you know how there's the concept of transference and countertransference in psychoanalysis that Freud kind of concocted. I think it's kind of similar. I mean, even though transference and countertransference tend to happen in a therapeutic setting, projection and reprojection might be just the same thing, if not completely the same thing. So that's like a really interesting reflection there. But in terms of your question about God, right?
Well, yeah, just like we all have to deal with this, how that we interact with reality, especially, and how that we interact with how that we conceptualize God, whatever, because whether you or I might call ourselves theist, atheist, agnostic, whatever else, we still have to deal with the whole world that's going to call themselves other things, but still everybody is going to also behave in religious ways, even if they call themselves not religious or not spiritual or whatever. And I think this is a lot of what Carl Jung was getting at, is trying to deal with these psychological facts. Maybe that's what I'm trying to get at, or what we're trying to get at, is how to deal with the psychological facts of things like belief or knowing God and those things. So like, how do we deal with these psychological facts of God, or maybe like, what are some better ways that we can understand these psychological facts of belief, like religions or mythologies or things like that? Because like if we don't consciously make a choice of whatever religious beliefs that we might have, it's like you don't get out of that. It's like if you don't choose your religion will be assigned to you, I think someone once said. So it's good if we can have a better at least understanding of that, even if we're not like putting it in religious terms or theological terms. So yeah, how do we deal with these psychological facts of theological facts, you might call it, or the facts of mythological belief even?
So, okay, since I have some sort of a scientific, also psychoanalytical background, the way I tend to think about it is that we're born into this world with an assigned religion, as you said. But, there's, of course, certain questions that every human has. So, why do we have consciousness? What is qualia? Why are we here? What is the universe? Why do we die? Why can't we be immortal? And I think all of these questions, or of course, unanswered and probably won't be answered for a really good amount of time, perhaps never even.
Yeah.
So I think we cope up with, these universal questions that are difficult and almost unanswerable. People tend to, develop ideas, and these ideas would be paganistic gods or religions, in order to cope up with, these universal questions. So,
Right.
The elements of hope, the elements of, worshiping a deity, so, they don't do something bad to us and stuff like that. So I think it is a coping mechanism, honestly, in terms of, opting a religion or choosing to be, choosing to be either a Muslim, either, Hindu, whatever, whatever
Right.
religion everyone prescribes to, because of all of these questions.
Right.
And it's kind of crazy to think that even like the scientific people are trying to ask the same questions, right?
Yeah, just different ways.
What is qualia? What are the different what are the different parts of the brain that we haven't really encountered? Why does mind reside within the brain? So it's almost as if the esoteric and the exoteric are trying to answer the same questions, but the esoteric tends to adapt more of a religious model in order to cope up with the fact that we cannot answer these questions.
Yeah.
While the exoteric, the scientific ones, are trying to actively test certain hypotheses, create theories, create mathematical architectures continuously to try to really answer the questions at a logical basis. So yeah, I think that's about it when it comes to that.
Well, the way that I would sum that up, and I'm wondering what you think, is the reality that we deal with is infinitely complex, and religion isn't a total answer, and neither is science. And those are kind of apples and oranges. They're not the same thing, but they try to get at some of the same problems, like you said. But they're both dealing with how to cope with the complexity of reality. Because if we didn't have things to deal with the complexity of reality, whether that's mythology or even mythological science, because science can be a little bit mythological, or almost like modern alchemy, in the sense that it acts like it has all the answers when it just has a fraction of a percent of the answers. And the big mythological or statement of faith that most scientifically minded people make is like, oh, if we don't understand that, then science will figure it out in like a few decades or a few millennia or something, which is another like mythological statement of faith. But what it all does is it's shortcuts to deal with the complexity of reality, which we kind of have to, because if we didn't have shortcuts to deal with the complexity of reality, we wouldn't be able to do anything, because reality is so infinitely complicated. But what do you think of that sort of summation?
So I think when we talk about religion and coping up with reality in general, one thing that comes into my mind is that, actually, apologies, can you maybe repeat that question again, like somebody said?
Yeah, so basically just that I was kind of summing your point, but also more of the way that I looked at it too, which is that these things, somewhat science and somewhat religion, are they are answers to complexity problems. They are answers to the complexity of reality, and that reality is infinitely complex, and that we don't really know how to act. But whether it's a sweeping answer from science, or a sweeping answer from religion, or some other mythological idea, it helps us deal with the complexity of life and reality. So what do you think of science and religion getting at, or being solutions for the complexity of life and reality.
Okay, so now I have the reflection. So, you know, back in the day, in terms of religion, you know, the alchemical stone, the philosopher's stone,
right.
Even within the Chinese tradition, the Egyptian traditions, and also the Roman and the Greek traditions, they tried to actively create potions via chemistry so that they can become immortal. And by becoming immoral, you know, they had this concept that maybe, you know, if I live forever, maybe I can, you know, understand why we're here, where we're going, what is the complexity of the universe, but also because of this greed and this fear of death, is another effect of that. And when it
or
comes
just
to
human
science,
limitation.
exactly. But when it comes to hard sciences, like quantum mechanics, then also biochemistry, biophysics, you know, all of these other elements of sciences, I think they try to actively test the complexities of reality via, you know, continuously experimenting with things that are so they first have hypotheses, and then they have to test whether this hypothesis is good or not, and then they come on to theories. And so, you know, like one example being, you know, the biggest question of what is consciousness, and what is this subjective experience? Why do we have subjective experience? You know, why does every human being has a subjective experience of their own, which is qualia. So when we get to answering those kinds of questions, they can be answered. You know, you can get a lot of scientific theories like information, like the IIT theory and the other theories, and you can also talk endlessly about, you know, like hypotheses and theories of consciousness, like, you know, Daniel Dennett's Consciousness Explained, Anil Said's Being You, in all of these books. But the main factor being that these complexities cannot be solved. So when we see both the spiritual, religious thing and then the esoteric, hard sciences thing, I think they are actively trying to, at least the hard sciences, they're actively trying to understand the complexities, but the dead end is that you cannot solve them.
Right. Yeah, we don't even understand how water works. I was in a room, Clubhouse room earlier tonight, and I've looked into that a little bit before, just studying complexity theory, that we don't even, like, the most fundamental element of life, which is water, the most important thing, or one of the most important things to our existence in this biosphere is water, and we have no idea how it works. Like, we're closer to understanding how to fold protein than we are to understanding how that water works. And the reason is because it's not just how that the H2O molecules come together, it's how that they interact with each other, and the interaction between them. But that's the tricky thing, is that we want to think of things in these like static images when things don't really exist that way in reality, especially not you know, within our cosmos or the mental reality. Things are constantly changing, things are processes, and then how they come together and how that we interact with them is a process, and it's a constantly changing process and a constantly moving target. And so the religious answer was to develop a behavior pattern or a personality pattern as that which to model our life and our behavior after. And that was the sort of answer, whether that's the Hindu or the Buddha answer, or the you know, Christian or the Muslim answer in the West, whatever that it is, that's a pattern of behavior, because there's nothing really static in this cosmos. But then the Enlightenment view is sort of like a Newtonian idea that we need to find all the causes and the effects and then be able to understand everything, where it's kind of like they put themselves in it's like a dog chasing its tail at that point. I don't know. It's because you can solve certain things, like we can find certain answers, like we know when water will freeze and when it will boil and how it will go from a solid to a liquid and a gas. But other than that, even simple things like water, we're pretty clueless about. We just know how to use it. Same thing with the everything within science. We can figure out how to use it, and that's how that we have all this technology. I'm talking to you right now, recording on the other side of the world, which is really, really amazing. And it works because of the physics and the things that we don't even know are going on, and like fiber optics going under the ocean and everything else. And that's physics, which is great because it helps us manipulate the world, but it doesn't necessarily tell us how to act. And so that's kind of like the problem of modern man, is he's figuring out like what the world is, but he doesn't really understand the pattern of how to act within it. And so that leaves him kind of in or leaves the modern person in a predicament where all he can do is try to figure things out more. But I don't know. What do you think? Is there any hope for the scientific view, or are they just stuck being overly rationalistic?
So just to briefly touch upon the physics aspect. Jung was at a dinner table with Albert Einstein back in the day.
Right.
And when Albert Einstein was explaining to him the general relativity theory that he had theorized, he was listening very keenly to him. And that's where he realized that, conceptualized the thing called synchronicity, right?
Yeah.
That's where it came from. That two events are simultaneously happening, even though they don't have like a same correlation.
Right.
And
meaningful coincidence.
Exactly. So it's crazy how much Jung drew from quantum mechanics and theorized it into the analytical psychoanalysis that he concocted.
Right.
So it's almost as if Jung borrowed a bunch of stuff from quantum mechanics in general. But when it comes to science being overly rationalistic, I think, yes, to a certain extent they are. Like when we talk about artificial intelligence, right, which is popular right now. So we have like according to Nick Bostrom, who's like an Oxford philosopher, he gives like a general framework. So there's narrow and deep AI, which we use now. Then there's artificial general intelligence, and then there's artificial super intelligence. Right. And right now we have the narrow deep AI. So, image recognition, voice recognition, and stuff like that comes within the narrow deep AI. And it's not that perfect at the moment.
Right.
But a lot of people working in Boston Dynamics and all sorts of other institutions working towards artificial intelligence and robotics are continuously trying to get to artificial general intelligence, which is basically that that the general intelligence would have the same cognitive capacities as a normal human being, which is kind of crazy to think, but I think it's going to happen like way ahead in time. So yeah, it seems that people are overly optimistic into getting into artificial general intelligence.
Do you think that might be almost like putting religious thinking into science, that if we get AGI, it will give us all the answers? But I don't know. What do you think? And as somebody who studies that,
I think if you get to artificial super intelligence, which is basically cognition beyond anything, beyond the human capacity.
Right.
So super intelligence,
Right.
And if we have super intelligence, artificial sentience, they might be able to answer those questions, or there might be an apocalypse, who knows. So I think, so I think ASI might be able to, take over these complexities and try to answer.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I guess the thing is how that we interact with those things. And then there's basically all of the religion, all the things that we were putting on religion in the past millennia, we're now putting on science. Like, how do we live forever? They're trying to solve aging and solve death. How do we, or whether that's just solving aging and death physically, or uploading our consciousness into, computers, things like that. And then it's like, okay, how do we get all the answers? Well, we're going to get that from some kind of artificial intelligence, whether that's AI, AGI, ASI, whatever the case. Isn't that starting to sound like religious behavior or thinking put onto scientific things?
So I think when we try to understand artificial intelligence at a very deeper level, it's basically that by creating artificial intelligence, we're getting to know more about how our brain and mind works. So it's like a reactionary effect there. And so in terms of religion, actually in Japan, where robotics is such a huge thing, they actually believe that robots have sentience because of their concept of kami, because of this animistic approach. And they tend to use robots for a lot of purposes, but they also think that robots have sentience, like they're normal citizens, but without rights and everything. So they cohabitate with the robots and they worship them religiously. And they also have ceremonial burial stuff, activities and stuff like that. So it's kind of crazy to imagine how religion is being religion is being synthesized or being symbiotic with like robots and automation.
Right.
So I think it's at least in Japan, I think it's already happening. So digital religion.
The digital religion, yeah. Yeah. So I don't know. What do we do now that we figured out? We all have some kind of these religious images or God images that we interact with on some level. Some of it more consciously than others. How do we solve everybody's religious problem, whether they want to or not? I mean, is the answer in technology, or is the answer in culture, or where's the answer? Solve everybody's problems.
I think it would be an assimilation of all the disciplines. So if you take like a multidisciplinary route, neuroscience, artificial intelligence, automation, robotics, philosophy, psychology, theology, all put together, you might be able to get to certain consensus at some point towards how to answer these complexities. It has to be multidisciplinary, because I don't think only one discipline can answer these complexities. It has to be multidisciplinary, at least from my
your perspective. Yeah. Okay, well, I think we did it. I think we solved the world's problems. Or started to solve the complexity as much as we could. So all right, well, I think we're about out of time. Is there anything else you want to add as far as your podcast, or anything else, how people might find you, interact with you, or any of those kind of things?
Sure. So the podcast is available. So the podcast is called The Naked Dialogue. It's on YouTube, on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and numerous other audio platforms. And people can find me on Twitter and on Instagram. These two apps that I tend to use actively, but Twitter I used to use very, very actively. And my username is basically Sanjana Singh X on both the platforms.
Okay.
So that's where you can contact me.
Okay, I'll link it. All right. So I think we did it. We solved all the world's existential angst. And yeah, so awesome. All right, so thanks a lot, Sanjana, and we'll stay in touch, and maybe we'll do this again sometime. And I really appreciate you recording a podcast with me.
Of course, thank you for having me on. It was a pleasure. I think this is probably one of the best interviews I've ever done.
Really? Wow.
I'm not even kidding. I'm not even kidding.
Wow. Okay, that's pretty mind-blowing and even flattering. So I appreciate that. we did get pretty deep though, and just a little over an hour. So awesome. So I appreciate it, and yeah, we'll probably do it again sometime. I think what might be interesting.
You can come on my podcast as well. I would love to have you on mine.
Oh yeah, yeah, for sure. Yeah, if you want to do that sometime, for sure, we can go on and discuss some things on the Naked Dialogue podcast. And then one thing I want to do is like a series sort of similar, springing off of this conversation, is talk about maybe when you get a chance to read Answer to Job, because that's where Jung kind of gets deep at these kind of questions at a lot of different angles. So maybe we'll do that, I don't know, sometime in the next few weeks or months, and get into that area when we have time to get to do that.
Of course. Let me know how you get to do about it.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so have fun there on the other side of the planet, and take care. See you around.
Take care.
All right, bye.